Under the twinkling lights of Snowbridge, Charlotte Whitaker moved through the grand ballroom of her family's estate with practiced poise. Every inch of the room radiated the magic of Christmas, from the towering tree adorned with golden ornaments to the soft strains of carolers floating through the air. Guests laughed and mingled, holding glasses of champagne as they admired the opulence of the Whitaker Holiday Gala. Yet Charlotte, standing at the center of it all, felt like a ghost in her own home. Her father, Walter Whitaker, was the host of the evening and the driving force behind every carefully curated detail. As the most influential man in Snowbridge, he relished the adoration of his peers, never missing an opportunity to flaunt his wealth and power. For years, Charlotte had been his silent accessory, the dutiful daughter paraded at events like this, where whispers about her always seemed to follow. The poor girl, they said. She's not like her mother was. She's ordinary. Ordinary. Charlotte had heard the words so many times it felt like a branding iron against her soul. She knew what they meant. The comparisons to her late mother's striking beauty, the way people avoided her eyes, and the cruel moniker, the ugly daughter of the millionaire. But she also knew that her father's relentless control over her life was what stung the most. Tonight, he was already pressing her about a prospective suitor he deemed suitable for her. It was the same old conversation wrapped in holiday cheer. As Charlotte slipped toward the quieter edges of the ballroom, she saw him before he noticed her. Jacob Langley, leaning against a far wall with a plate of untouched hors d'oeuvres, looked entirely out of place. His simple attire and modest demeanor stood in stark contrast to the extravagance of the evening. Charlotte had met him once before at the local library, where he worked as a librarian and historian, passionately advocating for the preservation of Snowbridge's oldest neighborhoods. It was a cause that pitted him directly against her father, whose latest development project threatened to raise the historic district to make way for luxury condos. Jacob caught her gaze and offered a small, genuine smile. She approached him, grateful for a reprieve from the stifling crowd. "Enjoying the party?" she asked, though the question was more habit than sincerity. Jacob chuckled softly. "It's a bit grander than my usual evenings, but I suppose that's the point. Your father knows how to put on a show." Charlotte grimaced but didn't argue. "And you? What brings you here tonight?" "I doubt my father extended a personal invitation. I'm here for the history," he said lightly, "or what's left of it. The estate is one of the last pieces of old Snowbridge standing, even if the man who owns it doesn't seem to value what it represents." Charlotte hesitated. Jacob's honesty was refreshing, though it teetered on the edge of dangerous. She knew her father wouldn't tolerate such bluntness, especially from someone who openly opposed him. But as she looked at Jacob, she realized how tired she was of hiding behind carefully chosen words. "He doesn't," she admitted softly. "Sometimes I feel like I don't belong here either." Jacob studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Then why stay?" The question hung between them, unspoken yet profound. Charlotte glanced around the room, at the glittering decorations and polished smiles. It was all a mask, a fragile illusion of perfection that hid her father's ruthless ambition and her own unhappiness. Why stay? The answer was complicated, wrapped in fear, obligation, and years of feeling like she had no choice. "I don't know," she said finally, "but I'm trying to figure it out." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Walter Whitaker's booming voice, calling for his daughter to join him. Charlotte felt Jacob's eyes on her as she turned to leave. "If you ever want help figuring it out," he said quietly, "you know where to find me." That night, as Charlotte lay in her ornate bedroom, staring at the ceiling, Jacob's words echoed in her mind. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond her father's control. What if she could break free? What if she could choose something different? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. The next day, Snowbridge bustled with Christmas preparations. Charlotte found herself wandering the snowy streets, drawn to the library where Jacob worked. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, maybe answers, maybe courage. Instead, she found a child. Tommy was sitting on the library steps, shivering in a threadbare coat, his face smudged with dirt. He looked up as Charlotte approached, his wide, desperate eyes freezing her in place. "Can you help me?" he asked, his voice trembling. I'm looking for my sister. Charlotte's heart clenched. In that moment, her own struggles seemed to pale in comparison. She knelt beside him, her voice soft but steady. What's your name? Tommy, he whispered. Tommy Grayson. Her mind raced. Snowbridge was a small town, but she couldn't place the name. Where's your family, Tommy? The boy hesitated, then shook his head. It's just Sophie now. She's all I've got. Charlotte's determination sparked to life. Without knowing how or why, she promised herself she would help Tommy. Whatever it took, she would find Sophie. Charlotte looked at Tommy and felt a swell of protectiveness she hadn't experienced before. Snowbridge was a town of stark contrasts. Its postcard-perfect facade often masked the quiet struggles of people like Tommy. She wrapped her scarf tighter around his small shoulders, trying to offer warmth in the freezing December air. Come inside, she said gently. It's too cold for you out here. Tommy hesitated, his eyes darting toward the library doors, then back to Charlotte. His thin frame was tense, as though he expected rejection or worse. Finally, he gave a small nod, and Charlotte guided him into the warmth of the library. Inside, the space was quiet except for the sound of Jacob shelving books. He turned at the sound of the door, his face lighting up when he saw her, until his gaze shifted to the small boy beside her. Concern flickered across his features. Who's this? Jacob asked, his voice calm but curious. This is Tommy, Charlotte replied. He's looking for his sister. Jacob crouched down to Tommy's eye level, his demeanor kind and unthreatening. Hi, Tommy. I'm Jacob. What's your sister's name? Sophie, Tommy said softly. She's older than me. I don't know where she is. Charlotte watched as Jacob processed the boy's words, his expression tightening with quiet determination. He nodded and stood, motioning for them to follow him to a small reading table. Let's start with what you know, he said. Over the next hour, Tommy shared what little information he had. Sophie, just 19, had been working odd jobs since their parents' deaths left them orphaned. They had been together until a social services mishap placed them in separate foster homes. Sophie had tried to keep in touch, but as time passed, the letters stopped, and Tommy had no idea where she'd gone. His voice wavered as he spoke, and Charlotte had to blink back tears. The resilience in his young face was heartbreaking. I've been looking for her, Tommy finished, his small hands gripping the edge of the table. But no one will help me. You're not alone anymore, Charlotte said firmly, reaching for his hand. We'll find her. Jacob nodded in agreement. We can check the local shelters and employment records. Sophie might still be nearby. Charlotte's resolve hardened. For the first time in years, she felt like she was doing something that mattered, not for her father's approval, not to maintain appearances, but because it was simply the right thing to do. As the three of them began planning their search, the oppressive weight of her usual responsibilities seemed to lift. There was purpose here, real and urgent. The next day, Charlotte and Jacob split their efforts. While Jacob visited the shelters and community centers around Snowbridge, Charlotte focused on leveraging her family's resources. Despite her fraught relationship with her father, she still had access to the Whitaker Estate's network of staff and properties. If Sophie had worked anywhere near Snowbridge, Charlotte was determined to find out. It didn't take long for her inquiries to bear fruit. One of the housekeepers, a kind woman named Mrs. Ralston, mentioned a young woman who fit Sophie's description. Sophie had been employed at a lesser-known Whitaker property, a remote guest house used infrequently for business retreats. Charlotte's stomach churned as she listened to Mrs. Ralston's account of the poor conditions Sophie had endured. Long hours, minimal pay, and little support. It was a stark reminder of the way her father's empire operated, valuing profit over people. I'll need the address, Charlotte said, her tone sharper than she intended. Mrs. Ralston hesitated, clearly uneasy about going against Walter's wishes, but Charlotte's insistence won out. That evening, Charlotte and Jacob drove to the guest house with Tommy in tow. Snow was beginning to fall, dusting the world in white as they approached the property. The house was dimly lit, its windows frosted over, and there was a desolate air about the place. Charlotte's heart pounded as she knocked on the door. A moment later, it creaked open to reveal a young woman with tired eyes and unkempt hair. She looked at them with suspicion, her hand gripping the edge of the door as though ready to slam it shut. "Sophie?" Charlotte asked, her voice trembling. The young woman froze, her expression shifting from guarded to stunned. Her gaze moved past Charlotte to land on Tommy, and her breath hitched. "Tommy? Sophie?" Tommy cried, rushing forward. The siblings collided in a fierce embrace, their sobs muffled against each other's shoulders. Charlotte and Jacob stepped back, giving them space, though Charlotte couldn't stop her own tears from spilling over. Watching them reunite was like witnessing a miracle. Sophie eventually pulled back, her hands cupping Tommy's face as she took him in. "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice cracking. Tommy glanced at Charlotte and Jacob, who stepped forward. "We helped," Jacob said simply. "Tommy's been looking for you." Sophie's eyes filled with gratitude, though her face remained shadowed by worry. "I didn't think anyone cared," she admitted. "I didn't know where to turn." "You're not alone anymore," Charlotte said, echoing the promise she'd made to Tommy. "We'll figure this out together." As they drove back to Snowbridge, the car was filled with the sound of Tommy and Sophie's excited chatter, their bond already mending the wounds of their separation. Charlotte felt an unfamiliar sense of pride and peace settle over her. This was what mattered, not the glitz of her family's fortune or the hollow approval of high society, but connections like this, built on kindness and trust. Jacob glanced at her from the driver's seat, a quiet smile on his face. "You did good, Charlotte," he said. For the first time in a long while, she believed it. The return to Snowbridge was quiet, the falling snow muting the hum of the car's engine. Tommy had fallen asleep against Sophie's shoulder in the back seat, his small hand clutching hers tightly, as though afraid she might vanish again. Sophie stared out the window, her expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. Charlotte sat in the passenger seat, stealing glances at Jacob as he drove, his focus steady but his jaw tight. The reunion had been a success, but the night was far from over. Charlotte's thoughts swirled as she considered the next steps. Sophie clearly had nowhere to go, and taking her back to the Whitaker guest house was out of the question. The idea of leaving her in such conditions after everything she'd endured was unbearable. But the alternatives were complicated, especially considering the looming shadow of her father's inevitable reaction. As they pulled into town, the festive lights of Snowbridge sparkled against the snowy backdrop, casting a warm glow over the streets. Charlotte turned to Sophie, who was watching the town pass by with a guarded expression. "You'll stay with me tonight," Charlotte said firmly. "We'll figure everything else out in the morning." Sophie blinked, startled. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," Charlotte replied, her voice leaving no room for argument. "You and Tommy need a safe place to rest. That's all that matters right now." Jacob parked the car outside Charlotte's townhouse, a modest yet charming home nestled on the quieter side of Snowbridge. It was one of the few things she had insisted on owning independently of her father's influence, and tonight, for the first time, it felt like a sanctuary. The group hurried inside, shaking off the cold as Charlotte led Sophie and Tommy to the living room. "Make yourselves comfortable," she said, grabbing blankets from a nearby cabinet. "There's tea in the kitchen if you want something warm." Sophie hesitated, as though unsure of how to accept the kindness being offered. Finally, she nodded, sinking onto the couch with Tommy still leaning against her side. Charlotte watched them for a moment before retreating to the kitchen, where Jacob was filling a kettle with water. "You're quiet," she observed. He glanced at her, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. "Just thinking." "About what?" He set the kettle down and leaned against the counter, folding his arms. "About what happens next. Sophie's safe for now, but this is just the beginning. She's been through a lot, and I doubt your father will be thrilled when he finds out you've gotten involved." Charlotte sighed, rubbing her temples. "He won't. But I'm not backing down this time." Jacob studied her, his gaze steady and unwavering. "You've changed," he said after a moment. "Maybe," she admitted. "Or maybe I'm just finally realizing what matters." His lips curved into a faint smile, but before he could respond, the kettle whistled. Charlotte busied herself pouring the tea, her thoughts still racing. By the time she returned to the living room, Sophie and Tommy were wrapped in blankets, their faces softening in the warmth of the fire Charlotte had lit. She handed Sophie a mug and sat across from them, the weight of the day pressing down on her. "Can you tell me more about what happened?" she asked gently. Sophie hesitated, her fingers tightening around the mug. "There's not much to tell," she said. "After our parents died, everything fell apart. Tommy and I were placed in different homes, and I tried to keep track of him, but things got messy. The guest house job was the only thing I could find, and I thought maybe if I saved enough, I could bring him back to me." Her voice cracked, and she looked down, ashamed. "But I couldn't even do that. I failed him." "No," Charlotte said firmly. "You didn't fail. You did everything you could, Sophie, and now you're back together. That's what matters." Tears filled Sophie's eyes, but she blinked them away, nodding silently. Tommy stirred beside her, murmuring in his sleep, and she brushed a hand over his hair. The love between them was palpable, and Charlotte felt a pang of guilt. For so long, she had been blind to the struggles of people like Sophie and Tommy, sheltered by her father's wealth and influence. Now, that world felt suffocating, irrelevant in the face of such raw, honest need. The hours stretched on, and soon the room was quiet except for the crackle of the fire. Sophie and Tommy had fallen asleep on the couch, their faces peaceful at last. Charlotte stood, draping another blanket over them before stepping into the kitchen, where Jacob was still sitting. "They'll need more than blankets and tea," he said quietly, as though reading her thoughts. "I know," Charlotte replied. "I'll talk to my father. Maybe if I explain." Jacob's scoff cut her off. "You think he'll listen? This is the same man who's willing to destroy a whole neighborhood for profit. I admire your optimism, Charlotte, but you need a backup plan." Her chest tightened. He was right, of course. Her father wasn't the type to be swayed by compassion, and her involvement with Sophie and Tommy would likely only deepen his anger. But she couldn't just stand by and do nothing. "I'll figure it out," she said, more to herself than to Jacob. He nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "I'll help however I can." His words warmed her, and she offered a small, grateful smile. "Thank you." As the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the town in silence, Charlotte's mind raced with possibilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, as she looked at the small family sleeping soundly in her living room, she felt a spark of hope. For the first time, she believed in the possibility of change, not just for Sophie and Tommy, but for herself as well. Morning came with a soft glow filtering through the windows, the snow outside shimmering under the pale winter sun. Charlotte stirred from her chair in the living room, where she had dozed off after ensuring Sophie and Tommy were comfortable. The siblings were still asleep on the couch, their faces peaceful in a way that tugged at her heart. For all the uncertainty ahead, this moment of quiet felt like a small victory. Jacob had left a note on the kitchen counter, promising to check in later and begin exploring longer-term solutions for Sophie and Tommy. His steady presence was becoming something Charlotte relied on more than she wanted to admit. There was a grounding strength in his quiet determination, a quality she found herself drawn to in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. As Charlotte prepared a simple breakfast, her thoughts turned to her father. Walter Whitaker was not a man accustomed to compromise, and Charlotte had no illusions about how he would react to her involvement with Sophie and Tommy. But she couldn't let that deter her. The night before, she had made a decision. She would no longer allow his expectations to dictate her choices. The sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. Sophie appeared in the doorway, her hair tousled and her eyes still heavy with sleep. "Morning," she said softly, her voice hesitant. "Good morning," Charlotte replied with a warm smile. "How do you feel?" Sophie hesitated, then shrugged. "Better than I've felt in a long time. Thank you for everything." Charlotte waved the gratitude away, but Sophie's sincerity lingered in the air. They sat together at the small kitchen table, sharing a quiet meal while Tommy continued to sleep. As they ate, Charlotte gently pressed Sophie for more details about her situation, trying to piece together a clearer picture of what had led her here. Sophie opened up slowly, recounting the years of hardship she had faced since her parents' deaths. The foster system had been a revolving door of instability, and her attempts to find steady work had been met with exploitation and disappointment. The guest house job had been her last resort, a desperate attempt to survive while holding onto the hope of reuniting with Tommy. "It's not just me," Sophie said, her voice thick with emotion. "There are so many people like me out there. Forgotten, overlooked. We just fall through the cracks." Charlotte's chest tightened. She had lived her whole life in a bubble of privilege, shielded from the realities Sophie described. Hearing it now, so plainly and painfully, felt like a call to action she couldn't ignore. "You're not forgotten anymore," she said firmly. "We'll find a way to make this right." Later that morning, Charlotte drove to her family's estate, her resolve hardening with each mile. The sprawling mansion loomed in the distance, a symbol of all the power and influence her father wielded. Inside, the staff moved with their usual brisk efficiency, their polite nods a stark contrast to the tension Charlotte felt as she approached her father's office. Walter was seated behind his massive oak desk, engrossed in paperwork. He looked up as she entered, his expression a mix of surprise and annoyance. "Charlotte, this is unexpected. I need to talk to you," she said, closing the door firmly behind her. Walter leaned back in his chair, studying her with the calculating gaze she knew all too well. "What's this about?" Charlotte took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "It's about one of your employees, a young woman named Sophie. She worked at the guest house." Walter frowned, clearly struggling to place the name. "What about her?" "She's been living in terrible conditions, barely making enough to survive. She has a little brother, Tommy, who ended up in foster care. They've been separated for years, and I found him wandering the streets. He was looking for her." Her father's expression hardened. "And you decided to get involved?" "Yes," she said firmly, "because someone had to." Walter rose from his chair, his towering presence meant to intimidate. "Charlotte, you don't understand how these things work. I employ hundreds of people. I can't keep track of every single one. And frankly, it's not my responsibility to solve their personal problems." Charlotte's hands clenched at her sides. "But it is your responsibility to treat them with dignity, to ensure they have the means to live, not just scrape by. You have the power to make a difference, but instead, you choose profit over people." Her father's jaw tightened. "Careful, Charlotte. You're treading on thin ice." "No," she said, her voice rising. "I'm finally standing on solid ground. You can ignore people like Sophie and Tommy, but I won't. Not anymore." For a moment, the room was silent, the air thick with tension. Walter's face was unreadable, his usual mask of authority firmly in place. "You're making a mistake," he said finally. "Getting involved in this will only lead to trouble." "Maybe," Charlotte replied, "but it's a mistake I'm willing to make." She turned and walked out of the office, her heart pounding. The confrontation had been as difficult as she'd expected, but for the first time, she felt free. She wasn't sure what would come next, but she knew she couldn't go back to the way things were. When she returned home, Jacob was there, waiting with Tommy and Sophie. The sight of them, together and safe, filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever battles lay ahead, she wasn't facing them alone. Together, they would find a way to build something better, for Sophie, for Tommy, and for the community of Snowbridge. Charlotte spent the next few days navigating a whirlwind of emotions and plans. Despite her father's cold dismissal, she had no intention of stepping away from Sophie and Tommy's plight. Snowbridge, with its picturesque streets and glittering Christmas decorations, seemed to hum with an energy of possibility, as though the season itself was urging her forward. Jacob became her closest ally during this time, his steady presence grounding her when doubts began to creep in. Together, they set about creating a more stable foundation for Sophie and Tommy. Jacob worked tirelessly to connect with local community organizations, and Charlotte tapped into her limited but growing network of friends and resources outside her father's influence. Sophie, meanwhile, struggled to adjust to the sudden shift in her circumstances. Though she was grateful to be reunited with Tommy and to have a roof over her head, the years of hardship had left her wary of accepting help. Charlotte noticed how Sophie kept to herself, often watching from the edges as others made decisions about her future. It wasn't distrust, exactly, but a deep uncertainty that anyone's kindness could last. One afternoon, As Tommy played with a donated set of building blocks by the fireplace, Charlotte sat beside Sophie at the kitchen table. A pot of tea steamed between them, the faint scent of chamomile filling the room. "You've been quiet," Charlotte said, her tone light but inviting. Sophie shrugged, her hands wrapped around a mug. "I'm not used to all of this." "All of what?" "People caring," Sophie admitted. "Every time I've tried to trust someone, it's fallen apart. I've had to figure things out on my own for so long that this feels strange." Charlotte nodded, understanding more than she could explain. Though their lives had been vastly different, she recognized the same cautious vulnerability in Sophie that she often felt herself. "It's hard to believe in something when all you've known is the opposite," Charlotte said softly. "But you don't have to do it alone anymore. Not with Tommy here. Not with us." Sophie looked at her, a flicker of hope breaking through her guarded expression. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." "I'm doing it because it's right," Charlotte said simply, "and because I've spent too much of my life ignoring things that matter. You and Tommy matter." Sophie didn't respond right away, but the tension in her shoulders seemed to ease. For Charlotte, that was enough. Change would take time, but the first step had been taken. That evening, Jacob arrived with promising news. He had spoken with the director of a local community center who was willing to help Sophie find steady work and housing. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Charlotte felt a swell of relief as Jacob outlined the plan, his quiet confidence giving her strength. "There's one thing," Jacob said, his gaze meeting Charlotte's. "The director mentioned they've been trying to raise funds for an expansion to support families like Sophie and Tommy. They're short on resources, and if they can't meet their goal, the project might fall through." Charlotte's mind immediately turned to her father. The Whitaker name carried weight in Snowbridge, and her family's wealth could easily cover the center's funding gap. But convincing Walter to contribute was another matter entirely. Their last conversation had left no doubt about his disdain for her involvement, and she wasn't sure she could stomach another confrontation. Still, as she looked at Tommy's sleeping form on the couch, she knew she had to try. The next day, she returned to the Whitaker estate, her determination solid despite the knot of nerves in her stomach. Walter was in his study, reviewing contracts with the same meticulous focus he brought to every business deal. He didn't look up when she entered. "You're persistent," he said, his tone dry. "I need your help," Charlotte said without preamble. Walter finally set his papers aside, regarding her with a mixture of curiosity and irritation. "I thought we already had this discussion." "This isn't about Sophie or Tommy," Charlotte said. "At least, not directly. It's about the community center. They're trying to expand to help families like theirs, but they don't have the funds to finish the project. You could make a difference." Walter leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "And why would I do that?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Charlotte said, her voice steady. "Because this town means something to you, even if you don't show it. And because you owe it to the people who've worked for you to give something back." Walter's eyes narrowed. "You're asking me to invest in a cause that has no return." "No financial return," Charlotte agreed. "But maybe something more important. Respect. Legacy. Redemption." The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Walter's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. He was silent for a long moment, the tension between them thick and unyielding. Then, with a sigh, he picked up his pen and began to write. Charlotte watched in disbelief as he filled out a check, the amount enough to cover the community center's expansion and then some. He slid it across the desk without meeting her eyes. "Don't make me regret this," he said gruffly. Charlotte took the check, her heart pounding. "You won't," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As she left the estate, the snow began to fall again, soft and steady. For the first time, she felt like she had truly stood her ground and won. This wasn't just about Sophie and Tommy anymore. It was about proving to herself, and maybe even to her father, that change was possible. When she returned home, she found Jacob, Sophie, and Tommy waiting for her, their faces lighting up when she shared the news. The check felt like more than just a financial lifeline. It was a symbol of hope, of what could be achieved when people refused to give up on each other. That night, as they sat together by the fire, The warmth of their connection was stronger than any fear or uncertainty. Charlotte knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew they would face it together. And for the first time in years, she felt ready. Charlotte woke the next morning with a sense of cautious optimism, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. The previous night's triumph had given her a glimpse of what was possible when she trusted herself to act with conviction. She wasn't naive. She knew her father's grudging support could waver at any moment, but for now, she held on to the small victory. The Whitaker donation to the community center became the talk of Snowbridge within hours. Word spread quickly in their tightly knit town, and for once, the gossip surrounding the Whitaker name wasn't clouded by disdain or envy. People marveled at the sudden generosity of Walter Whitaker, a man known for his business acumen but not his charity. Charlotte knew the truth. This wasn't about her father's change of heart. It was about the people who needed it most, like Sophie and Tommy, and she was determined to ensure the funds were used wisely. By midday, Charlotte found herself back at the community center with Jacob, Sophie, and Tommy. The director, a warm and energetic woman named Martha, welcomed them with open arms. The small building buzzed with activity. Children played in the corner, volunteers sorted donations, and staff members moved quickly to handle the growing demand for their services. It was a hub of hope, bustling despite its limited space. Martha's gratitude was palpable as she showed them the plans for the expansion. Blueprints were spread across a worn table, detailing a vision that would double the center's capacity and add essential resources for families in need. Charlotte studied the plans carefully, impressed by the thought and care that had gone into every detail. For the first time, she felt the weight of her family's privilege being used for something meaningful, and it filled her with quiet pride. Jacob and Martha discussed logistics, while Charlotte sat with Sophie and Tommy in the corner of the room. Tommy was busy coloring, his tongue sticking out in concentration as he carefully stayed within the lines of a Christmas-themed page. Sophie watched him with a faint smile, her expression softer than Charlotte had seen it before. "This place is amazing," Sophie said quietly, her voice laced with a mixture of awe and longing. "I can't believe people care this much." "They do," Charlotte said, "and so do you. That's why you'll fit right in here." Sophie looked at her, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "What if I'm not good enough? I've messed up so many times. I don't want to disappoint Tommy again." "You won't," Charlotte assured her. "And even if you stumble, you have people to catch you now. You're not alone anymore." Sophie didn't respond immediately, but the tension in her shoulders eased. It was a start. As the afternoon wore on, the community center hummed with renewed energy. Volunteers came and went, offering congratulations to Martha and her team on securing the funding for the expansion. Charlotte noticed how people greeted Jacob warmly, their smiles genuine. It was clear he had built strong connections in the town, even as he had chosen a quieter life than her own. She admired him for it, realizing how different their paths had been despite growing up in the same community. Later that evening, as the group returned to Charlotte's townhouse, Tommy's excitement was infectious. He chattered endlessly about the community center, the other kids he had met, and the games he couldn't wait to play again. His joy was a reminder of why they were doing all of this, giving him and Sophie a chance at something better. Over dinner, the mood was light, the kind of warmth that came from shared purpose and connection. Jacob teased Tommy about his coloring skills. Sophie laughed softly at Charlotte's attempts to cook, and for a brief moment, everything felt almost normal. It was a glimpse of what life could be, stripped of the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future. But Charlotte knew better than to think it would all be smooth sailing. The following morning brought a sharp reminder of the challenges still ahead. She was sitting in her living room with Sophie and Jacob when a sharp knock sounded at the door. Charlotte opened it to find her father's assistant, a polished man named Victor, standing on the porch. His expression was carefully neutral, but his presence alone was enough to set her on edge. "Miss Whitaker," he said formally, "your father requests your presence at the estate. It's urgent." Charlotte's stomach tightened. She knew this moment would come, but the suddenness of it caught her off guard. "I'll be there soon," she said, her voice steady despite the unease curling in her chest. As Victor left, Jacob appeared at her side. "Are you okay?" Charlotte nodded, though her mind was already racing. He probably wants to talk about the donation. I'll handle it. You don't have to do this alone, Jacob said gently. I know, she said, meeting his gaze. But I need to face him. She arrived at the estate a short while later, bracing herself as she stepped into her father's study. Walter was seated behind his desk, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. I heard you've been busy, Walter said at last, his tone carefully measured. I have, Charlotte replied evenly. And I'm not stopping. Walter's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying her with a mixture of curiosity and something else she couldn't quite place. You've changed. Maybe I have, Charlotte said. Or maybe I've just stopped pretending to be someone I'm not. Her father's lips pressed into a thin line. You've put the Whitaker name on the line with this. People are watching, and they'll expect results. Good, Charlotte said. Then let's give them something to be proud of. For a moment, she thought he might argue, but instead, Walter surprised her. He nodded, a reluctant but unmistakable gesture of approval. Don't waste this opportunity, Charlotte. I won't, she promised. As she left the estate, a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying seemed to lift. Her father's begrudging support wasn't the wholehearted endorsement she might have hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. And for now, that was enough. Back at the townhouse, she shared the news with Jacob, Sophie, and Tommy. Their relief was palpable, and together they began laying the groundwork for the next phase of their journey. With the community center expansion secured and Walter's cautious backing in place, the path ahead seemed a little clearer. That night, as snow fell softly outside, Charlotte sat by the fire, Tommy asleep on her lap. Jacob and Sophie talked quietly across the room, their voices low and comforting. For the first time in a long while, Charlotte allowed herself to believe in the future. It wasn't perfect, and there were still battles to fight, but they were building something real, something lasting. And in the warm glow of that moment, it felt like a miracle. Charlotte's resolve grew stronger as the days unfolded. The snowfall in Snowbridge grew heavier, transforming the town into a pristine winter wonderland. The lights twinkled brighter, and the streets were alive with festive energy as Christmas approached. But amidst the beauty, Charlotte felt the weight of her responsibilities pressing down on her. The work was far from over, and the closer she got to making real changes, the more she realized how much resistance remained. At the community center, the expansion project had begun in earnest. The funds her father had reluctantly provided were being used to renovate the old building, with plans to add new classrooms, a play area, and even a small housing unit for families in transition. Charlotte found herself spending more time there, helping however she could, coordinating volunteers, organizing supplies, and offering support to Martha and her team. It wasn't the kind of work she was used to, but it was deeply satisfying in a way she hadn't expected. Jacob was a constant presence by her side, his quiet confidence balancing her moments of doubt. His knowledge of the town and its people proved invaluable, and his ability to connect with others brought a warmth to the project that Charlotte admired deeply. The more time they spent together, the more she felt her guarded heart begin to soften. There was something about Jacob's unwavering belief in what they were doing that made her believe in herself, too. Sophie, meanwhile, had begun to find her footing. With the promise of stable housing and a support network, she started volunteering at the center, helping with tasks as simple as organizing donations or reading to the children. Watching her grow more confident each day was a source of pride for Charlotte, though Sophie's lingering doubts still surfaced in quieter moments. One such moment came on a cold December morning, as Charlotte and Sophie sorted through boxes of winter clothes that had been donated to the center. Tommy was nearby, playing with a group of other children, his laughter filling the air like music. "I don't know how you do it," Sophie said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Do what?" Charlotte asked, glancing at her. "All of this," Sophie said, gesturing to the busy room around them. "You make it look so easy, like you've always known what to do." Charlotte smiled, shaking her head. "It's not easy. I'm just figuring it out as I go." Sophie looked at her skeptically. "Yeah, but you've got everything. Money, connections, people who listen to you. I'm not like that. I'm nobody." Don't say that, Charlotte said firmly. You're not nobody, Sophie. You're strong. And you've been through things most people couldn't handle. That makes you someone worth listening to. Sophie hesitated, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. What if I mess it up? What if I can't be what Tommy needs me to be? Charlotte placed a hand on her shoulder, her voice gentle but resolute. You already are. Tommy doesn't need you to be perfect. He just needs you to be there. And you're here now. That's what matters. Sophie nodded, though her expression remained uncertain. Charlotte knew the road to self-acceptance would be long, but she was determined to walk it with Sophie, step by step. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the town's Christmas lights flickered to life, Charlotte returned home to find Jacob waiting on her porch. He was bundled in his usual winter coat, his breath visible in the crisp air. The sight of him brought an unexpected warmth to her chest. I was starting to think you were avoiding me, she teased as she unlocked the door. Jacob grinned. Just trying to give you space. But I've got news, and I thought you'd want to hear it in person. She motioned for him to come inside, where they settled by the fire with cups of hot cocoa. Jacob leaned forward, his expression serious but excited. Martha told me today that the town council has taken notice of the work at the community center, he said. They're considering adding more funding to expand similar programs across Snowbridge. Charlotte's eyes widened. That's incredible. It is, Jacob agreed. But it also means more scrutiny. The council will want to see results, and if we don't deliver, they might use it as an excuse to cut future funding. The weight of his words sank in. While the news was promising, it also came with heightened pressure. Charlotte knew they couldn't afford to falter, not when so many people were counting on them. We'll make it work, she said finally, her voice steady. We have to. Jacob smiled, his gaze lingering on her. I believe you. The quiet moment between them stretched, the flicker of the fire casting warm shadows on the walls. Charlotte felt a stirring in her chest, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something she wasn't ready to name. But for now, the companionship was enough. The days leading up to Christmas were a blur of activity. The center's renovations were progressing faster than expected, thanks to a surge of community volunteers inspired by the project's success. Families began to trickle in, seeking help and finding hope in the welcoming space. Charlotte found herself constantly on the move, juggling tasks and decisions with a determination that surprised even her. But as Christmas Eve approached, she felt the familiar pull of her family's traditions. Despite everything, the Whitaker Holiday Gala was still a cornerstone of the season, and Charlotte knew her absence would be noticed. Walter had already made it clear he expected her to attend, if only to maintain appearances. Jacob was understanding when she explained the situation, though his disappointment was evident. I get it, he said, but don't let them pull you back into their world completely. You've come too far. His words stayed with her as she prepared for the evening, slipping into a simple but elegant dress and pinning her hair back. The gala was as extravagant as ever, the Whitaker estate transformed into a glittering spectacle of wealth and power. But as Charlotte moved through the crowd, exchanging polite greetings and deflecting questions about her recent activities, she felt a growing sense of disconnect. This wasn't her world anymore. It had never been. Her father, ever the consummate host, approached her midway through the evening. You're quiet tonight, he observed, handing her a glass of champagne. Just taking it all in, she replied, her tone neutral. Walter studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. You've done well with the community center, he said unexpectedly. People are noticing. It reflects well on the family. Charlotte blinked, caught off guard by the rare acknowledgement. That's not why I'm doing it. I know, he said, but that doesn't mean it's not important. For a fleeting moment, she saw something in her father's eyes, pride, perhaps, or a faint glimmer of understanding. It was enough to remind her that change, even in small measures, was possible. As the evening drew to a close, Charlotte slipped away from the party, her thoughts turning to the people who had become her true family. Snowbridge's streets were quiet under the moonlight, the snow crunching softly beneath her feet as she made her way home. Tomorrow was Christmas, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Christmas morning arrived in Snowbridge with a tranquil beauty, the world outside blanketed in soft, untouched snow. The town, often bustling with activity, seemed to pause, its streets silent save for the occasional distant sound of bells or the laughter of children. Charlotte woke early, the warmth of anticipation stirring her as she wrapped herself in a robe and stepped into the living room. The soft light of the Christmas tree cast a golden glow over the space, and for a moment, she stood there, taking it all in. Sophie was already awake, sitting on the couch with Tommy curled up beside her, still asleep. She looked up as Charlotte entered, a faint smile crossing her face. There was a lightness to Sophie that Charlotte hadn't seen before, a hint of peace that seemed to have settled over her in the past few days. "Merry Christmas," Charlotte said softly. "Merry Christmas," Sophie replied. She glanced down at Tommy, her hand brushing his hair gently. He was so excited last night he could barely sleep. Charlotte chuckled, settling into the armchair across from her. "I'm not surprised. He's been talking about Christmas nonstop since the decorations went up." Sophie hesitated, her expression turning serious. "I don't know how to thank you, Charlotte, for everything. I didn't think this kind of Christmas was possible for us." "You don't have to thank me," Charlotte said. "Seeing you and Tommy happy is all the thanks I need." Sophie nodded, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Before either of them could say more, the sound of footsteps on the porch drew their attention. Charlotte rose to answer the door, and when she opened it, she found Jacob standing there, his cheeks flushed from the cold and his arms laden with a large basket. "Good morning," he said with a smile. "I come bearing gifts." "Come in," Charlotte said, stepping aside. "You're just in time." Jacob entered, setting the basket on the kitchen counter and taking off his coat. He greeted Sophie warmly, and when Tommy stirred and opened his eyes, his face lit up at the sight of Jacob. "Jacob!" Tommy exclaimed, bounding off the couch to hug him. "Did you bring presents?" "Maybe," Jacob said, grinning, "but you'll have to wait until after breakfast." Tommy groaned in mock protest, earning a laugh from everyone in the room. The morning unfolded in a comfortable rhythm, the smell of coffee and pancakes filling the air as they worked together to prepare breakfast. Charlotte couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so at ease, surrounded by people who made the holiday feel meaningful in a way her family's opulence never had. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily, filled with stories and laughter. Jacob shared memories of past Christmases in Snowbridge, while Sophie talked about the small traditions she and Tommy had managed to keep alive during their years apart. Tommy, ever the energetic storyteller, described his excitement over the community center's new play area, his enthusiasm contagious. After breakfast, they moved to the tree, where a modest collection of gifts awaited. Charlotte watched as Tommy tore into his presents, his joy infectious. Sophie's gifts were simple but thoughtful: a warm scarf, a journal, a set of watercolor paints that brought a rare smile to her face. When it was Charlotte's turn, she was surprised to find a small package addressed to her in Jacob's handwriting. She opened it to reveal a delicate pendant on a silver chain, engraved with a tiny snowflake. "It reminded me of you," Jacob said, his voice quiet, strong and beautiful, even in the coldest times. Charlotte felt her cheeks flush, her fingers brushing over the pendant. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's perfect." As the day wore on, the sense of togetherness deepened, each moment filled with warmth and connection. It wasn't the extravagant celebration Charlotte had grown up with, but it was better, real and unpretentious, rooted in love and hope. Later in the afternoon, Martha arrived with news from the community center. She had come to deliver updates on the expansion project and to thank Charlotte personally for her efforts. The center was thriving, she explained, and the new spaces would be ready within weeks. Charlotte felt a swell of pride at the news, knowing that the work they had done was already making a difference. But as they talked, Martha's expression grew thoughtful. "There's something else," she said, glancing at Sophie. "I've been talking to some of the families at the center, and one of the women mentioned recognizing Sophie." Sophie stiffened, her eyes widening. "Recognize me? How?" "She said you used to work together, at the guest house," Martha said gently. She wanted me to tell you that you're not alone. She remembers how kind you were to her, even when things were hard." Sophie's hands tightened in her lap, and for a moment, she seemed at a loss for words. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. "It's good to know I made a difference, even in a small way." "You did," Charlotte said firmly. "And you still are." The day stretched into evening, and as the first stars appeared in the sky, they gathered once more around the fire. Tommy had fallen asleep on the couch, his head resting against Sophie's shoulder, while Jacob and Charlotte sat side by side, their shoulders almost touching. "You've done something amazing, you know," Jacob said, his voice low. "I didn't do it alone," Charlotte replied. "None of this would have happened without you, or Sophie and Tommy." Jacob looked at her, his gaze steady. "You're giving yourself too little credit. You took the first step, Charlotte. You fought for something that mattered, even when it wasn't easy. That's not something everyone can do." She held his gaze, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and something more profound. "I had to," she said. "For them. For me." The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the room as they sat there in the quiet comfort of each other's presence. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Snowbridge in a soft, endless white. For the first time in her life, Charlotte felt truly at home. This was Christmas. Not the glittering galas or the endless expectations, but the warmth of love, the strength of connection, and the quiet hope of a better future. In that moment, surrounded by the people who had become her family, she felt a peace she had never known. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, everything was exactly as it should be. The days following Christmas carried a quiet kind of magic, as if the spirit of the holiday had settled over Snowbridge like the snow itself. The community center buzzed with activity as renovations picked up speed, with volunteers working together to prepare the new spaces for the families who needed them most. Charlotte found herself deeply involved, her hands rarely idle. Whether it was coordinating schedules, painting walls, or simply lending an ear to someone who needed to talk, she felt a sense of purpose unlike anything she'd experienced before. Sophie, too, had become a familiar face at the center. Her initial hesitation had softened, and she began taking on more responsibilities. From organizing donations to helping with childcare, she threw herself into the work, her confidence growing with each passing day. Charlotte watched with pride as Sophie began to find her voice, her once guarded demeanor giving way to warmth and determination. One afternoon, as Charlotte was sorting through boxes of winter coats, she noticed Sophie talking with a group of volunteers. Sophie's laugh rang out, bright and unrestrained, and for a moment, Charlotte paused, savoring the sound. It was a reminder of how far they had all come. Not just Sophie and Tommy, but herself as well. This wasn't just about providing a roof or a meal. It was about rebuilding lives, including her own. Jacob appeared at her side, carrying a clipboard and a cup of coffee. "She's doing great, isn't she?" he said, following Charlotte's gaze. "She is," Charlotte agreed, a smile tugging at her lips. "It's like she's finally starting to believe in herself." "That's thanks to you," Jacob said. "You gave her a chance when no one else did." Charlotte shook her head. "She did the hard part. I just opened the door." Jacob's expression softened. "You do that a lot, you know." "Do what?" "Open doors for people," he said. "And not just the obvious ones. You make people feel like they matter." Charlotte's cheeks flushed, and she looked away, focusing on the coat in her hands. "I guess I'm finally figuring out what matters to me." Jacob didn't respond immediately, but his presence was steady, grounding. For all the chaos and uncertainty they'd faced, she had come to rely on him in a way she hadn't realized until now. It was more than his quiet competence or his unwavering support. It was the way he made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity, and by the time the volunteers began to pack up for the day, the sky outside had turned a deep indigo, streaked with the last remnants of sunlight. Tommy, who had spent the day playing with a group of other children, ran up to Sophie, his face flushed with excitement. "Can we stay longer?" he asked, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I want to show Sophie the new playroom." Sophie laughed, ruffling his hair. "Not tonight. buddy. We'll come back tomorrow." Tommy pouted but didn't argue, and as they gathered their things, Charlotte felt a wave of contentment wash over her. This was what she had been searching for all along. Not the approval of high society, not the hollow victories of her father's world, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing she was making a difference. As they stepped outside, the cold air nipped at their faces, and Tommy's breath formed little clouds as he chattered away. Jacob walked beside Charlotte, his hands in his coat pockets, the silence between them comfortable. "Do you ever think about what's next?" Jacob asked suddenly. Charlotte glanced at him. "What do you mean?" "After this," he said, nodding toward the community center behind them. "The renovations, the programs, everything we're building. What happens when it's done?" Charlotte considered the question. She hadn't thought much beyond the immediate future, too focused on the work at hand to let her mind wander. But now, as the question hung in the air, she realized she didn't have an answer. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I don't think I can go back to the way things were." "You won't have to," Jacob said. "You've already changed too much for that." His words were both comforting and unsettling, a reminder of how far she had come and how much further she still had to go. For all her progress, the future remained uncertain, a blank slate waiting to be filled. But for the first time, she felt ready to face it. That evening, back at her townhouse, Charlotte found herself alone for the first time in days. Sophie and Tommy were spending the night at the community center, helping with a holiday event for families in need, and Jacob had returned to his small apartment in town. The quiet was almost disorienting, a stark contrast to the constant activity that had filled her days. She sat by the fire, a book in her lap, but her thoughts kept drifting. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, a reminder of the expectations she had spent so much of her life trying to meet. But now, those expectations felt distant, irrelevant. She wasn't the same person who had once longed for his approval, and she wasn't sure she wanted it anymore. As the fire crackled softly, Charlotte reached for the pendant Jacob had given her, the cool metal smooth against her fingertips. The snowflake design caught the light, and for a moment, she let herself imagine a future where she didn't have to choose between who she was and who she wanted to be. Maybe, just maybe, she could have both. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Surprised, she set the book aside and rose to answer it. When she opened the door, she found Jacob standing there, his expression unreadable. "Jacob," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. "What are you doing here?" "I was thinking about what I said earlier," he said. "About what's next. And I realized something," he said, stepping closer. "It doesn't really matter what comes next, as long as we're in it together." Charlotte felt her breath catch, her heart thudding in her chest. For a moment, she couldn't speak, the weight of his words settling over her like the snow falling softly outside. "I'd like that," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob's smile was warm, and as they stood there in the doorway, the future didn't seem so uncertain anymore. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, one step at a time. And in that moment, Charlotte knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The weeks that followed brought a quiet sense of accomplishment as the community center's expansion neared completion. The new rooms were freshly painted, filled with donated furniture and supplies, and bustling with anticipation for the families who would soon benefit from the space. Charlotte found herself spending nearly every day at the center, her hands busy and her heart full. Snowbridge seemed to buzz with a renewed sense of purpose. The townspeople, once wary of change, had embraced the project, their support pouring in through donations, volunteer hours, and heartfelt encouragement. Even Walter Whitaker, though still distant in his demeanor, had begun to soften. He had attended a recent fundraiser for the center, his stoic presence a quiet acknowledgement of the importance of the work being done. It wasn't a transformation, but it was a start. Sophie and Tommy were flourishing in ways Charlotte had only dared to hope for. Sophie had taken on a part-time role at the center, her natural empathy and growing confidence making her a favorite among the children and families who came through its doors. Tommy, meanwhile, had found a sense of stability that allowed his boundless energy and creativity to thrive. Charlotte often watched them with a sense of awe, marveling at their resilience and the love that bound them together. One snowy afternoon, as Charlotte worked in the center's new library, Jacob appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, his presence as steady and reassuring as ever. "You're going to wear yourself out," he said, a smile tugging at his lips. Charlotte glanced up from the stack of books she was organizing, her own smile forming. "Someone has to keep this place running. You're allowed to take a break, you know," he said, stepping into the room. "The world won't fall apart if you let someone else carry the load for a while." She rolled her eyes, but there was warmth in her tone. "I'll consider it." Jacob moved closer, his expression turning serious. "There's something I wanted to talk to you about." Charlotte set the books aside, sensing the weight in his voice. "What is it?" He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "You've done so much here, Charlotte. You've given this town something it didn't even know it needed. But what about you? What do you need?" The question caught her off guard, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. She had spent so much time focusing on the center, on Sophie and Tommy, on the people of Snowbridge, that she hadn't stopped to consider her own future. "I don't know," she admitted. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be, but I'm not sure what comes next." Jacob nodded, his gaze steady. "Maybe it doesn't have to be something big or planned. Maybe it's just about letting yourself be happy." Charlotte felt her chest tighten, the simplicity of his words striking a chord deep within her. "What if I don't know how?" "Then you let the people who care about you help," he said softly. The weight of his words hung between them, unspoken but deeply felt. For all her strength and determination, Charlotte knew he was right. She didn't have to do everything alone, and she didn't have to have all the answers. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. Before she could respond, the sound of laughter echoed from the hallway. Sophie and Tommy appeared, their cheeks flushed from the cold. Tommy carried a bundle of handmade Christmas decorations, his excitement palpable. "Look what we made!" he exclaimed, holding up a garland of paper snowflakes. Charlotte smiled, reaching out to admire his handiwork. "They're beautiful, Tommy. Let's hang them up." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of laughter and activity as they decorated the center's main hall. Volunteers and families joined in, filling the space with warmth and joy. By the time the sun began to set, the hall was transformed, its walls adorned with garlands, lights, and hand-painted ornaments. As the final touches were added, Martha stepped forward to address the gathered crowd. Her voice carried a mix of gratitude and pride as she thanked everyone for their contributions and spoke about the center's bright future. When she turned to acknowledge Charlotte, the applause that followed was both unexpected and overwhelming. Charlotte felt her cheeks flush, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. She glanced at Jacob, who offered her an encouraging nod, and at Sophie and Tommy, whose smiles reminded her of why she had started this journey in the first place. After the gathering dispersed, Charlotte lingered in the hall, taking in the quiet beauty of the space. Jacob joined her, his presence a comforting anchor. "You did this," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "We did this," she corrected, meeting his gaze. "I couldn't have done it without you." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled with the weight of everything unsaid. Then Jacob reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "I've been thinking about something," he said, "about how much better life is when you're not facing it alone." Charlotte's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. "Jacob, I'm not asking for anything right now," he said quickly. "I just wanted you to know how I feel, and that whatever comes next, I'd like to be part of it." Her eyes glistened, and she gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "You already are." The snowfall outside had slowed, the world wrapped in a blanket of stillness. As Charlotte stood there, surrounded by the life she had helped create, she felt a deep, abiding sense of peace. The road ahead might still hold challenges, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She had found her place, her purpose, and her people. And in the quiet glow of that moment, she knew that was all she needed.